Reserve. The root of all our evil, it begins with the Federal Reserve. Hey, yeah, well, let's go back in time when everybody was so proud of a man.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero. Today, Rachel Wilson joins me. Rachel has been working on an episode with my friend Courtney Turner of the Courtney Turner podcast, and she wrote a book called Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. I had Rachel on to discuss feminism, how it's affected all of us, and how we see it in our lives. So I think you'll enjoy this one. I know Rachel has become a little bit of a firebrand here recently, but she's a sweet woman, and I really enjoyed this conversation. She's a family woman, a stay-at-home mom, and she's doing some really good work out there. So I was happy to have the chance to sit down and talk with Rachel. FoxandSons.com. Fox and Sons is the coffee brand that starts my day every day. If you want coffee, you want a big, bold coffee. That's a BBC in your mouth. Get all up in these guts. But that's Fox and Sons coffee, man. FoxandSons.com has the best coffee out there. And if you go to Fox and Sons and use promo code ZERO, that's promo code ZERO, you will get 18% off of your purchases at FoxandSons.com. So go to Fox and Sons. Steve Fox is not only a family man teaching his children about his love of coffee and entrepreneurship, he's also a good friend of mine, and I always love chatting with him and look forward to my Fox and Sons coffee every morning at foxandsons.com. Promo code ZERO at checkout. Libertarianinstitute.org is where you'll find Year Zero, this podcast you're listening to right now, Vital Dissent with Patrick McFarlane, Scott Horton Show, Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight. You'll also find a bunch of writers like Kim Robinson and Will Porter and Jim Bovard, all doing great work at the Libertarianinstitute.org. So go to the Libertarianinstitute.org and show your love for the work that we are doing. Thank you, Tom Burton, for the music. Enjoy the show. Okay, there we go. We are recording. I am here with Miss Rachel Wilson, the infamous author of Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. How are you doing?
That's me. I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. I've been really looking forward to this. I have not completed your book, but I have been perusing through it ever so often and just picking out tidbits and going, wow, man, that's wild stuff. So I can't wait to really dig in deep on that book. I'm reading 5 other books right now, and I'm like, I want to read it, but I just
I do the same thing. I do the exact same thing. I start a bunch of things and jump around, and yeah, I do the same thing.
I was telling Marc Clair the other day, we were talking about the attention deficit that we all suffer nowadays due to social media and the internet 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah.
And I was like, he's like, man, I find it that I have trouble like focusing on a book. I was like, man, I'll do that. I'll start reading something and I'll get like 10 minutes into it and I'll put it down because my mind is going somewhere else. But I'm too stupid to give up on reading. So I just go pick up another book and start reading it. Before I know it, I'm reading like 6 things.
Well, luckily I have the audiobook coming back out. I had an audiobook done previously, but I wasn't really happy with it. So I had it redone, and that should be up like literally any day. And for me, I'm very good at listening while I'm doing other stuff. And that actually helps me focus. Like if I'm doing housework or some kind of mundane task, then I'm actually paying attention to what's in my ears, and I can absorb things really well that way. I don't know if everyone's that way, but that kind of works for me. Audiobooks.
Did you get Dylan Mulvaney to read it?
No, I did not.
He seems to be selling a lot of stuff right now.
He sure is. He sure is. I'm getting kind of tired of looking at him, to be honest. But maybe that's a topic for another time.
That might be a good marketing scheme, though.
Well, yeah, I guess if I could just, I mean, I think the thing that bothers me about him is that his impression of a woman is like a perpetually 8-year-old girl who's very silly and goofy. And I'm like, do these people think we like don't grow up, or like, because that's not what my life's not like that at all. Right. But I feel like when it comes to trans people who are male to female, they do one of two things. They either are little girls or they're like sexy chicks, right? They never look like me. They're never just like in a sweater, you know, with their hair in a bun doing housework and cleaning up kid puke. They don't have to do all the unglamorous parts that I have to do of being a woman. It's all very dress up and very performative for them, you know? So I think that's like one of the most annoying things about it for me personally as a woman, is just having to see, like, you're just scrolling through Twitter or Instagram or something, and it's just like one after the next of like, I'm a sexy stripper trans person, or I'm a cute little silly girl trans person. And I'm like, that's not what a woman is. But like, I will begrudgingly unite with the TERFs on the trans question a little bit. Like, I will actually put aside my differences with them for a minute to unite on that one topic sometimes. So.
Well, I actually think that subject kind of fits really well into your book and what you talk about a lot, is because there's the idea of that Jung had about the anime and the animus, right? And and the man in his mind encompasses or he gravitates towards this woman that he envisions as the mother. Okay. And when a man gets angry, and this is, like I said, I'm just kind of breaking down Jung here. When a man gets angry, if you notice, he gets kind of bitchy, he gets screechy, he gets kind of like feminine in the way that he expresses anger. And what Jung says is that emotional side of a man is encompassed by their archetype, their personal archetype of the devouring mother or of the mother. And so if you have an unhealthy relationship with a mother, and that is what the archetype, I think what the trans community is doing, especially the men to the women, they're acting out the archetype that is stuck within their mind.
Yeah, I'm right with you on that. I agree with that 100%. And my mother-in-law years and years ago, because she was into like the occult and was a wild party girl back in the 70s before she converted to Christianity and settled down and had a family. And she always would say, because she was in San Francisco, like in the gay scene and stuff, and she was very into that whole world. And she would always say that all of her close, like male gay friends had like serious mom issues, and that oftentimes they had like, there was some kind of weirdness that went on when they were kids, where the mom would walk around in front of them in their lingerie, or like some kind of inappropriate sexuality, like not even like molestation or anything like that, but just like the mother had like a sexy image or something. And she felt like that had something to do with the fact of how they ended up being homosexuals or cross-dressers or drag queens or things like that. And I mean, I grew up in like a tiny rural town and never had much exposure to that until I was an adult and moved away. So at the time I was kind of like, maybe like that's kind of interesting, but this was before the trans thing became as huge and everywhere as it is now. And now I feel like I can see what she means when she says that. It kind of makes more sense to me that there's something going on there.
Yeah, there's some deep underwriting of some sort of a trauma or image that these people lived through.
Yeah.
Definitely. But let's kind of like steer the conversation, because I don't want to get bogged down in the trans like
Sure.
talk. I'll get us canceled before we even get started.
Yeah.
Your story is pretty interesting, and what led you to write this book is you had all these doubts in your mind about what you were being taught. So can you walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, sure. So I was raised by parents who got divorced. I had like a kind of, I feel like a typical 80s setup where I had like an ultra liberal Marxist mom who got indoctrinated in college. And then I had like a neoconservative, like Rush Limbaugh kind of dad. And so shockingly, the marriage did not work out. And my mom initiated the divorce, immediately got a boyfriend who was like way younger than her, closer to my age than her age. And it really wasn't great for me or my sister at all. But it was like we kept hearing this narrative over and over of, well, she has to be happy. She has to be happy. You wouldn't want her to not be happy, which as a kid, I didn't question too much. I was like, well, sure, I love my mom. I want her to be happy. And then as I got older, I kind of did what most of us were doing in the late 90s. When I graduated from high school in 98, I had a boyfriend for a couple of years already. I wanted to get the heck out of my parents' house. I moved in with the boyfriend, and we got pregnant when I was 20. And to me, I was like, oh, well, this is sooner than I planned, but isn't this what we were going to do anyway? So to me, it wasn't like a big deal. He didn't take it so well. And he hung around for 2 more years, and we had 1 more baby, but he ended up leaving because he was like, I know this is terrible timing and I should have said something a couple years ago, but I'm just not ready for all this. So I was like 22 with 2 babies, and I had to work, like so many people do now, because we were young and we were broke. And I remember when I had my first daughter, I had to go back to work really soon, like within a few weeks of having her. And suddenly the job that seemed important to me before did not matter. It just didn't seem important compared to this human being that I had, who I was her mom. And I remember driving to the first day of dropping her off at daycare so that I could go to work, and thinking, okay, I'm taking my daughter to another lady's house who I'm going to pay half of what I make today so that she can do the job that I should be doing, while I go pretend to care about making money for some giant corporation, and I get to pay daycare and taxes for the privilege of doing so. And I was like, who came up with this system? This sounds terrible. It seems really inefficient and really stupid. And I remember voicing this opinion to the women around me, and I got a chorus of women telling me, you'll get used to it. You'll get used to it. The baby will get used to it. The baby will get used to it. And I thought, I don't want to get used to it. This sucks. I'd have to be away from her 10 hours a day. By the time I get home and get her dinner and a bath, it's time for her to go to bed. I've barely seen her. I didn't want to be a part-time nights and weekends mom. That wasn't good for me growing up. I didn't want to do that with her. But I was, involuntarily in this situation where I had to be for a while. And that was just kind of like the defining moment where I really started to just question, like, why is this the system why are we all doing this? I feel like we all know this is stupid, but we're pretending like it makes sense. It just felt like that to me. It felt like I was looking around going, nobody else thinks this is dumb. Nobody else is like, has a problem with this. And so once I got a little bit older and I met my current husband, I got remarried. It was wonderful because he was super excited about me staying home, and we wanted to have more kids. We've got 5 now. And I wanted to stay home and he wanted me to stay home. And he was like, I'll do whatever I got to do to make it work. So we like made a lot of sacrifices. We moved to a cheaper area. We got a smaller place. It was cramped, but it was fine. And he worked his butt off so that I could stay home and be with the kids, so that I could nurse them and not have to take them to daycare all the time. And it was very strange. But again, most of the women around me did not like this. It was like they had so many objections. It was like, well, don't you think you're going to regret that? What about your career? And what if he leaves you? And well, what if you start to get older and he leaves you for someone younger? And everybody fear-mongered me to death about all the things that could go wrong if I didn't have my own money and a backup plan and all this stuff. And the reason I ended up, writing the book and doing debates with other feminists online, like the way I eventually ended up doing that, is because I got so used to, and therefore good at, defending my own choices. I was like, it doesn't seem like I should be getting this much hostility for wanting to raise my own kids. I think what I'm doing is the normal thing, and what you all are doing is like the new abnormal thing, right? And I was shocked how much pushback I got from women about it. So that's kind of where it came from.
I want to ask you, because I've heard this before, and I'm not being rude, but one thing I've never heard you touch on, so it just clicked in my head as a question I should ask, is you said your mom had initiated the divorce.
Yes.
Did your dad verbalize any, like, was he trying to stop it?
Yeah. Oh yeah. My dad wanted to, he wanted to do whatever it took because he didn't want to be separated from us. My parents I was kind of an oops pregnancy too. And once I was born, my dad was just like, I don't want anyone else raising my daughter. I want to be with her. And I don't think he and my mom were star-crossed lovers who just had to marry each other. It was kind of more like, well, we have a baby now and it's 1980, so I guess we'll get married. But my dad, he loved my mom. He wanted to work it out. He wasn't terribly unhappy or anything, but to give you a little insight into her worldview, she had volunteered for Planned Parenthood when she was in college. She defines herself as a radical Marxist feminist. She felt that having children was holding her back. Never been able to get her to explain what it was holding her back from, because it's not like after we grew up, she went off and did something fantastic. She didn't. And so she was chasing this thing that I feel like so many modern women chase, where it's like, I'm bored and I want excitement, or there's got to be, it's like that FOMO, fear of missing out. There's something better out there for me. What if I'm missing out on someone or something better, and my life is boring and mundane and I have to do house chores, like that kind of thing.
She read too much Jack Kerouac.
Oh, she was very into Marion Zimmer Bradley. I don't know if you've ever dug into Marion Zimmer Bradley, but she is like a crazy feminist, child abusing psychopath. But she rewrote the Arthurian legends from a feminist perspective.
Oh.
And so basically pick any feminist trope, my mom fell right into it. Totally fell into it. And I think a lot of it was out of envy and her perception that she never saw herself as attractive, even though she was a ballerina, and I would say that she was a pretty attractive woman, but she was always very envious of other women. And I think she thought feminism was these stupid bimbos with big boobs who are, they just get everything they want and no one cares that I'm smart, because she was very intelligent, very, very brilliant, intelligent woman, but a little bit crazy. Well, a lot crazy. She's had mental health and addiction issues as well all her life. So my dad really tried to work it out. He didn't want this. She just kind of announced, I have a new boy and you have to move out. And that's that.
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering.
Where everyone was just telling him, well, this is how it works now. And so, and he didn't, so he fought for custody and he tried to stop it, but she was going to do what she wanted to do, I guess.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering where that seed had been planted. And I was thinking, well, I've never heard you speak about your father's reaction to all this. Like, and I think that could possibly have just kind of, because you say you tell the story and you're like, suddenly I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, no, there was a seed. That seed grew there, but there was a seed planted somewhere. And I was just wondering if that's what it had occurred.
Yeah, it wasn't so much my dad's reaction, but it was like this. So my childhood went from being one where I had a stay-at-home mom. I lived in I had like an idyllic childhood for me. We lived in a cute little suburban small town cul-de-sac with all my friends. It was like in the 80s where all the kids played together and were outside all the time. And I walked to my school that was only 2 blocks away and walked home with my friends every day. And my mom was there and my dad was there and my parents were married and everything was really great for me. And when my mom decided she's just going to blow up the family, it was suddenly I'm going at 5 a.m. to a daycare to some lady who's not very nice to me and clearly doesn't want me around, but is getting paid. So I'm there. And, so I'm waking up super early to be dropped off at a daycare. And then I got to ride a bus for an hour before I get to school and then ride it again for an hour before I go back to the babysitter and then wait for my mom to pick me up. I only see my dad twice a month now. Like it blew up my whole life as a 9-year-old kid. And all I ever heard, like you're 9 years old and you're trying to put together like, okay, why is this happening? Because my mom found a younger dude that she's into. And so now like I have to go through this. My sister has to go through this. My dad's life is horrible. Like my dad was super devastated. He did not want to only see us every other weekends. He wanted to live with his children and raise them. And he ended up getting custody of us at a certain point, actually, because she was so unstable, which was good. It was like a good thing for us. And it was kind of a relief, but it was more just like, wait, so, because if my dad had done that, this is me as a teenager going, if my dad had just decided to get a younger girlfriend and leave the family destitute because he found someone younger and hotter, nobody would say, well, he needs to be happy. Don't you want him to be happy? Yeah. Nobody would say that. He'd be universally demonized. Everyone would think he was a horrible person. But because my mom was the one who did this, everyone around was very like, well, she needs to be happy, and you can't make things work if they won't. And it was just like very permissive of her to just do this. And I was like, wait a minute, what about me? What about my sister? What about it made no sense to me that there was this really obvious double standard early in my life, that if you're a woman, you can just blow up everyone's life around you on a whim because you want to be happy, right? We don't let men do that. Men are not allowed to do that. And if they try to do something like that, they're always demonized. So, I mean, that seed was definitely planted then where I saw this double standard and thought, that seems kind of messed up. I don't like that. But yeah, when I had my own kids, I think everybody changes when they have their kids. But that was when I really understood, because I was thinking to myself, what it would be like for me to do that to my kids. And I couldn't even fathom it. I couldn't conceive of just being fine with like, sorry, but your dad's moving out and I'm moving my boyfriend in. It was so like it was just not a thing. And I couldn't imagine doing that. So, I mean, that was a big point where I really started to think about how things work and like how the expectations for men and women are different and those sort of things. And then, like I said, I had to justify staying home with my kids because everybody thought that was weird. And then I decided to homeschool them. So I was super weird, right? Like, oh, you're going to stay home and homeschool them? What are you, one of those weird fundamentalist people? So I just got very good at defending this. I mean, not only to my own mom, but even to people around me who you wouldn't expect, like other people who would consider themselves like conservative Christians or like, good old, like go to church twice a year and vote Republican types of people were very much horrified that I didn't have a career and my own money. And they thought I must be, it was like this idea that my husband must be like pushing this on me. Or like we would go to family barbecues and I would bring him his plate of food and his beer. Like I would make his plate up and grab him a beer and bring it to him. And the women in my own family would be like, I'm going to do that. Don't even think about having me. You can get up and get it yourself. Your legs aren't broken, like to their husband. So I always thought that I was the normal person, and that it was so bizarre that everyone around me thought that the way I was acting was weird. So yeah, I just feel like if you're nice to your husband, that's weird. If you want to be a full-time mom, that's strange. And like you're fear-mongered so much. It's always, and what if? And we don't do that to career women.
Yeah. I want to touch on that because like some of what you're saying, a lot of what you're saying, I've witnessed in my life, and I'm sure a lot of people have. So, all right. So there is this idea that the feminists have fed women that there are no consequences for their actions.
Yeah, for sure.
So anything that they're uncomfortable with, they can just do away with. Right. And so when I went to the military, I was married to my first wife, and she was pregnant with our third kid. And I went away to the military. I went through basic. Granted, we were both young. There's a lot of things that can be understandable about the whole situation from her perspective. So I'm not like downplaying my role in this. But she divorced me after I had made it through basic. I had got set at Fort Bragg, got us on base housing, was moving the family up there. All our stuff was being shipped up there. We get up, we make this 16-hour drive up there. We're there for 4 hours. She tells me, yeah, I don't want to be here. I want to go home. She ends up moving in with the guy who used to be her best friend. They're still married today. So one of the really bad experiences I had was once I got out of the military, I was trying to have regular visitation with my kids, but she did not want me to have regular visitation.
Yep.
So anytime I wanted to see my kids, I had to call her, get permission to see my kids, and make sure that she had nothing planned. And so sometimes it would be a month before I got to see my kids. And there was one time I was sitting on the couch with my daughter. My daughter was about 11 at this time. She wasn't even quite a year old whenever we got divorced. So she was about 11 this time. And we're sitting on the couch. We're watching UFC. She's playing with the calluses on my hands because I work for a living. And she said, Daddy, Mama just wants you to go away so we can be a normal family. And it's like, that was one of the most painful things I ever had to deal with, because I knew that it would do me no good to retaliate against their mother and talk bad about her. So I just never talked bad about their mother in front of them, because I knew that was just me asking for a war that I couldn't win because I didn't have the time on my side to instill my point of view in them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I realized it's like she thought that divorcing me meant that I was no longer around, and that it was like taking out the trash.
Yeah,
in a way. And did not take into consideration the ramifications that it would have on the children, and that I was still going to be a part of those children's lives.
Yeah, I feel like women in general, I get a lot of pushback for saying the things I say because everybody thinks I'm talking about women like I'm not one. But this is not a view that I have, right? I don't even have this view with my ex. I never, ever did. In fact, I was always begging for him to have more involvement because that's their dad and they need their dad. That's super important. I know and am aware of the statistics of what it's like for kids that don't have their dad. And just, me remarrying and them having, my husband now is like their dad as well. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to grow up going, where was my dad? Why wasn't he around? Like, you know what I mean? That was a thing they did have to deal with. And I was always trying to encourage the relationship. But I feel like in general, women today think that whoever they're with now, they like that person better. And the other guy is like, ugh, like, oh, I don't even want to deal with him. Even if he's not a bad guy and didn't do anything horrible, it's like they just don't want to think about that part of their past. And they wish that they could just cut you out of all the pictures and like stick the new guy in there. And you can't do that, because your children get half their identity from their dad, whether you divorce him or not. So when women do that, they're cutting half of the child out of the picture too, is how I feel. And I think that we've always had a view of men as expendable anyway. We treat women as though women grow up with this idea that they are special and precious and perfect just the way they are. And, you know, they don't need to change for any man. You know, this is something that drives me insane. And you'll hear women say things like, if he can't handle me at my worst, he doesn't deserve me at my best. You never hear a man talk like that. You never hear a man. Because men learn as boys that their value in this world is dependent upon what they can produce, what they can do for people. You know, it's dependent on them being productive. You don't just get an easy path in life for being a boy. Whereas when you're a girl, you know, you go through puberty and suddenly, you know, you have boobs and you're fertile and the world does value you just for existing. Your first adult experience as a female is, oh, I am valuable because of my anatomy and my ability to bear children. So women do get this idea, and then it's really strongly reinforced by all the feminist pop culture stuff we're dealing with. They do get this idea that have you seen those videos where they ask girls on the street on a scale of 1 to 10, like, where do you think you are? And every single one of them thinks she's a 10.
Yeah.
That's the unrealistic universe that young women live in, right? They all think they're a 10. They all think they deserve the best. They don't ever consider that they might have things they need to work on, personality flaws, maybe even some narcissistic behavior that's really unhealthy. No. All they hear is, girl, you are a queen, right? You are perfect just the way you are. And don't you never let no man tell you nothing. All this stuff. This is just like the programming that we get. And then we have this short window of time where we have this crazy amount of power because of our fertility. And what young women don't realize is that that is temporary. It's temporary, and I feel like it's temporary on purpose, because God knew if we had that capacity throughout our lives, we'd become completely evil. So you only have it for like your teens and 20s. Then you hit 30, and what happens? Life starts to change. Even if you're attractive, even if you're a hot 30-year-old, when you get to be 30, 35, 40, you're not 22 anymore. And it's a whole different game of life. And most of those kind of girls with that mentality don't adjust very well, and they have a ton of problems. But all that to say that I think that women do see men as expendable. And especially now with dating apps, they think all they got to do is swipe for a new one. I'll just swipe and get a new one, right? So it's like they'll have babies with some guy and be like, he's not doing it for me anymore. Swipe. And they think that they can just do this to their children. And that's like my primary motivation for talking about this stuff more than anything, is that 60% of kids are growing up with moms that work full time. A large number of kids are being born out of wedlock, raised in divorced homes. The instance of abuse in homes without both biological parents. So anytime you've got a step parent, a mom's boyfriend, a dad's girlfriend, whoever it is in the house, the rate of abuse goes way up, and the severity of child abuse goes way up. Yeah. The statistics about what divorce does to children, what fatherless homes do to children, is super clear and completely indisputable. And that's why a lot of times when I argue these things, I use a lot of statistics, because it's like, you can't argue that. We know that these things put kids at risk for everything from doing jail time, going to juvie, addiction, depression, ADHD, all the things, right? All the risk factors in life go way up for kids when they are raised, in broken homes. And that's most kids nowadays. And women initiate 70% of the divorce. And if you are a college educated woman, that number goes up to 90%. So maybe think about that before you guys marry college-educated women. The odds aren't so good there. But yeah, so it's the reason I hammer the women so much is because I want them to understand that there are consequences, very serious consequences to this attitude of like, I need to be happy. That comes first. I can't be a good mom if I'm not happy. Because it's like, well, what's happy, right? You just think swapping out a new dude's going to make you happy.
Right.
Maybe the problem is with you. Maybe you have stuff you need to work on, and that's why you keep getting a new dude every year or two or something. So, I mean, that's the reason, is because I care about kids and I care about the future generations and how they're being raised, because everything that's wrong with society kind of starts there for me.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm so passionate about it, and that's why I go so hard on the feminists sometimes. I'm sorry, ladies, but somebody's got to do it. And the men can't do it. If the men try to say what I say, they're just a dirty misogynist. They're a horrible person. He's a narcissist. Every man is a narcissist, right? Any man who has boundaries with women or tells a woman no, he's a narcissist. He's a psychopath narcissist. So I feel like the men can't say it because they just get lambasted. Whereas if I say it, at least they kind of have to pay attention to what I'm saying and try to argue with me. And historically, that hasn't gone very well with them for them. So.
Well, and another thing you brought up are the warnings that your family was giving you about being a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
And all right, so my mom had me when she was 17. She didn't graduate high school. She didn't even get a GED. And her and my dad got married. And he graduated and went to college. Now he went to a college that was local, and didn't like go away to college. But as soon as he went to college, that's what her family did. He's going to college. He's going to meet another woman. He's going to meet somebody smart. He's going to meet somebody that's graduated high school, blah, 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 blah. And that pushed my mom to the edge. And she asked my dad, do you want a divorce? And my dad said, well, I don't know. Do you? And she ended up filing for divorce and divorcing my dad. And they divorced. And they actually remarried when I was 6 years old. But there is a period of time, about 4.5 years of my life, where my dad wasn't there from the age of like 2 to 6, where I never saw him, or saw him rarely. It wasn't like my mom kept me away from him, but we moved to Florida and my dad was still living in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And so, it was just not feasible to see him on every weekend.
Right.
And so, they ended up they did get back together whenever I was 6 years old, but there's that period of time that my mom has left my dad because of these images and these ideas that other people have planted in her head, and ended up putting herself and me through like bad situations, abusive relationships, et cetera, and eventually finding her way back to my dad, thankfully. Yeah. But there are all those things that she experienced, and she feels guilt, or has felt guilt over, dragging me through at a young age. And that wasn't helpful to her in any way. No.
And I mean, think about this. When a young lady says, I'm going to go to college for whatever thing, does everybody around her go, well, I don't know. Are you sure that's what you want to do? And well, what if there's not a lot of employment in that field? And well, you say you want to be a dentist, but what if you lose your hand in a freak accident? Then what are you going to do? Like, nobody cooks up all these crazy scenarios to terrify women who are going to take the college and career path, even though arguably there's probably a very good chance that won't work out, even maybe more so than just having a normal marriage where the woman doesn't. I mean, if men only initiate 30% of the divorce, that's not the worst odds for the woman. That's better odds for her. And how many women, like I know personally several women that I went to school with, I was the only one that didn't go straight off to college. And the reason I didn't, I'm very smart. I was always in like advanced classes and all that stuff. But I realized early on that school was not about learning anything, and it wasn't for smart people. And I thought school was like, this is like the libertarian streak in me. It was like for conformity and to train you to obey and to make you into a good little cog in the wheel. And you weren't allowed to like think critically or ask questions or things like that. Kind of behavior was more punished in the schools that I was in. So the thought of paying money to go through that for 4 more years, I was like, nah, now I'll figure out something. I'm not doing that, right? I'm not going into debt so that I can go to more school. That just seemed, again, really stupid to me. But all my friends did. They all went to college. They went to universities. They all accumulated a bunch of debt. I have one friend that's got $250,000 in college debt. She went to 3 very prestigious schools, hit 35, and that biological clock started ticking hard. So she got married and had a baby. And as soon as she had the baby, she wanted to stay home. Now she's going to be paying an exorbitant college loan payment for the rest of her life. She'll probably never pay it off. And it's like, how did that help her? I don't understand. And this is the other thing about that that's so crazy. Women have a window for motherhood. Men don't. Men can start a family when they're 40 and be fine. In fact, and for some of them, they should, because it gives them time to acquire resources and maybe have more status than they would have when they were younger and attract a better wife and things like that. But women, we don't have forever to have babies. I know they want you to think that you can just freeze your eggs and do all this horrible in vitro, which that stuff is hell to go through. It's super expensive. And it's like, why are we telling women to spend their fertile years building a career and going into debt, and then tell them that after you've done all of that, that's the time to start thinking about babies? What? Again, I felt like I was the only person on earth who thought that was super backwards. I'm like, this is clearly backwards. Why would you not tell women to have their children in their 20s and then say, when your kids get older and you do have more time, then you'll have plenty of years to go to college or do other things. You have a whole second half of your life that women don't even think about. So that's actually my advice. When young women ask me advice and they're like, oh, my parents think I need to go to college and have a career, but I know I want to have a family. I'm like, then do that first. Do that first. I do have one friend I grew up with that she had her first child right around when we graduated from high school. I think she was actually pregnant when we had to do the like graduation walk. And then she had him right after. And everybody thought she was going to be a loser and a nobody because she was a teenager who got pregnant, right? All the stereotypes. Well, she wanted to stay home with her kids too. But because she was young and she married her children's dad, but they were poor, they were young. So she was like, well, I'll babysit. Turned out she was really good at daycare. So she had this really good daycare business in her home where she could still raise her kids. And then while she was doing that, she went to school very part-time so that she didn't have to go into debt or get loans. It took her 10 years. So that's a long time to be patient and follow through with something. But it took her 10 years, and she got a master's in early childhood education with like an emphasis on special ed. And her youngest is graduating from high school this year. And now she's got like this amazing history of doing the daycare stuff and a degree. If she wants to, she can go off and work for another probably 30 years in that field. And she never had to accumulate the debt. She had her kids in her window of fertility. She stayed married. Everybody's doing great. It's like, why is that not the norm? That should be the norm. Sending women off to get, the average woman leaves college with $36,000 in debt. The majority of college debt is now held by women. 65% of all college loan debt is held by women. And we wonder why the birth rate is 1.34 for like, white American women. That's why. Because after you've spent 4 years and 36 grand, you're not going to just jump right into having kids. You're not just going to get married and have babies right away. And most of them put it way off or never do it at all. Or if they do, they just have maybe one child because daycare is expensive and it interferes with your career to have more than 1 or 2 kids. So I think I explain in the book how I think things ended up that way and why I think things ended up that way. But I think it was on purpose. I think it was intentional. There's a lot of, antinatalist people who are the ones that brought us feminism as we know it today. So I just think it's all backwards. And I'm just trying to make the case to people that I think there's better ways to do things.
Well, as I said, my mom never got a GED. She didn't graduate high school. She ended up, after her and my dad got back together, and were remarried. My dad was working basically 3 full-time jobs. He was doing 2 construction jobs, plus he was working retail lumber sales, and she was working full-time in the insurance field doing workman's comp. She started off in the mailroom, and she worked her way up to making over 6 figures a year. So it's not like you have to have a college degree to be successful. You just have to have a strong work ethic and to stick with something and learn a skill or a trade. And so it's all a lie when it comes to college. And again, that's another one of those rabbit holes we could probably go down for hours on end.
Yes. The college scam.
Yes. Let's dig into some of your findings. When you started this book, what did you expect it to be?
So when I started the book, I thought I was going to take all of my best debate points, all of my best arguments about the statistics and the financing of like who funded the feminist movement. Because one thing I did already know was that it was not this grassroots movement that you're always told that it is, and that a lot of the funding came from like the big golden age industrialists and like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, which if you know anything about those guys, they got their little fingers in every single pot doing, all kinds of social engineering. So I thought it was going to be about that. But when I started doing the real research, and it took me like 2.5 years, because I knew this book would be controversial. I knew most people would think it was nuts. And I was like, I had better have like really good citations. I had better like just make sure everything's as solid as it can be, because I know it's going to get scrutinized. So I took 2.5 years researching. And when I was studying like the earlier roots of feminism, and I'm profiling the different feminists who had the most influence, I noticed this weird thing that many of them were into the occult. They were all, spirit mediums or fortune tellers or tarot card readers, or they were theosophists or new age, like proto new agers, and had some really wild spiritual beliefs that influenced their feminism. And a lot of them were into things like goddess worship, witchcraft. Wicca wasn't around yet, in the 1800s, but it was the kind of stuff that led up to that. And I was like, this is weird. And I kept finding it over and over and over with almost every feminist that I profiled. So I was like, okay, I can't ignore this part of the story. This is, number one, really interesting. Number two, super crazy. Like, as you're reading the book and you read about these people, you're like, what? They were doing what now? So I knew I had to tell that story because it's a big deal. I love philosophy, and it gets it down to like the philosophical and spiritual roots of feminism, which the story we're told, the narrative everyone hears, is that history for women was terrible. Women's lives were unbearable. We were chained to the stove and forced to give birth until we died in childbirth. And we were stuck in the kitchen, and we couldn't leave our house, and our husbands could just beat us and rape us. And it was like, like life for women was so unbearable. And then one day in the late 1800s, women just looked around and they said, we've had enough of this and we want to vote. And so they took their little picket signs and they went out and marched in the streets until they got the vote. And then everything got better from there. That's what most people believe. That's not what happened at all. In fact, suffrage was incredibly unpopular with women. All the polling data that we have leading up to 1920 for about 30 years or so says that only about 4% of women were interested in the vote at all. And they had very good reasons. So I found that there was much higher membership of women in anti-suffrage groups than there was in pro-suffrage groups, which I thought was super interesting. So I started looking at these anti-suffrage women's groups and the pamphlets that they were putting out and things like that. And they had incredibly good reasoning for why they didn't want the vote. And it aligned with a lot of the stuff that I had already noticed in my own life. Like they would say, well, it's going to divide the family. Why do we need 2 votes in one family? That's going to cause conflict. That's number one. Number two, politics is kind of dirty business and it can be very unpleasant. And we don't want to have to do we don't want to have to be drafted into the army. We don't want to have to do jury duty and hear all the details of the most grisly crimes and everything. No, that's men's stuff. Let the men do that. And they thought that what they were doing was very important. They were like, look, we are the organizers in the community. If there's anything going on at churches, we're usually the ones handling that. We're raising the kids. We're taking care of the elderly. We're taking care of the infirmed. If there were orphans, women were taking care of them. They felt like they had a lot of influence in society. They felt like what they were doing was important. And they were like, why do we need to be in politics? My husband handles the politics. I don't want to have to learn about every single candidate and learn economics and all this other stuff to try to be voting when I'm busy raising a bunch of kids and doing what I want to do. And it was funny because as I was reading ungodly amounts of feminist literature, pray for me because you don't know what it's like having to sit there and read this nonsense for hours at a time. But as I would read like the 1800s feminist writings, they were always mad that they couldn't get women interested in their boring feminist theory books and pamphlets that they were writing. And they would specifically say, it seems like all they want to do is talk about fashion and go to parties and have potlucks and knit things and share recipes. And they just don't seem to care about feminist theory. So they kind of tricked them a little bit. It's like they realized they weren't just going to get women into feminist theory, right? So they would do things like write fiction and tell the stories in a way that you might notice this. A lot of movies, TV shows, even now, whenever a woman is giving birth, it's always portrayed as hell. She's going to die. The baby dies in birth. The mother dies in birth. The husband is always either a dumb, good-for-nothing oaf that the woman is taking care of like he's a child, or he's an abusive, horrible person who just is brutalizing her and controlling her every move. So they would use things like fiction to influence public opinion. And then we got some of the big funding, the big gun funding behind it. And that's really what gave us the vote. And that's what gave us things like women's studies departments. So if you're wondering why haven't you heard the Rachel version of feminist history, why have you only ever heard the normie version of it? It's because when the Ford Foundation started women's studies departments in the late 60s, they became the gatekeepers of this history. And they tell you in their own words that they changed the history because they said, well, history as it was written by men, right? And so we're going to rewrite the history from the standpoint of the oppressed woman. And it's called standpoint feminism. This is like a well-known thing. If you go to a gender studies or a women's studies class in university, this is what you'll hear in the first few weeks of your class, that yes, we rewrote the history from the standpoint of the oppressed woman. It's called standpoint feminism, and that's the history we have now, which is why I went back and did all this research to get
so it's like
story.
It's like the 1619 project.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly like that. And they've done the same thing with LGBT history too. All of the LGBT history is gatekept by organizations within universities that specifically tell you they are activist groups. So they're only going to, I just did a stream on Magnus Hirschfeld with my friend Courtney Turner yesterday. And isn't she the best? We are very good friends.
She is so awesome. I was actually shocked when I found out y'all knew each other. I was like, what?
Yeah. Once we met, we just hit it off right away. We have the same brain. So, and we have the same approach to research and stuff like that. And we're doing a series on the history of psychology. And we talked about the LGBT stuff and how, you know, there was total creepers and weirdos doing god-awful experiments on vulnerable populations, but they're always portrayed as brave, courageous heroes because these LGBT groups are the ones in charge of the history. They have all the papers, they have all the archives, they have all the like digital records of everything. And so it's very easy for them to skew things and censor stuff and gatekeep the information. So I go digging to find out like what really happened. And so there is information in the book about the funding, because that is a really important key piece. But I talk a lot about the spiritual and occult roots of feminism, how it's always connected to this idea of goddess worship, how it's a reactionary movement against Christianity. The reason they hate Christianity is because they hate God the Father. They don't like the patriarchal structure of the church or of God's creation for us. And so naturally, what they gravitate towards is things like witchcraft and goddess worship, theosophy, New Age religion that has this very effeminate feel to it. And we're seeing a big resurgence of it now with a lot of the psychedelic movement, because I talk about Terence McKenna and Timothy Leary in the book a bit, because they were super into goddess worship. And there's something, I've never taken psychedelics, but there seems to be something that happens. Like Aubrey Marcus is a good example of this. Very masculine dude, started doing a bunch of psychedelics, and suddenly he's like a male feminist and he's super into goddess worship and he's a cuckold and all this stuff. So it's a very specifically anti-Christian thing to be feminist. And a lot of women can't wrap their head around it.
You mentioned Hollywood, and it got me thinking that whenever you see like a scene in a movie where the mom is meeting the dad in a parking lot and the son or the daughter runs up to the dad, they make it look so glorious, like this reunion that is so glorious. But when you see like I don't know why it keeps popping in my head, but Married with Children,
yes,
they make the married couple look so miserable.
Yes,
right,
totally. And I mean, I see and hear that all the time. So my husband runs a very popular debate channel, and people know that we're married, and I've debated on his channel and things like that. And when feminists are trying to dunk on me, it's always like, well, I'd rather be single and independent than be married to that jerk, your husband, you know, and they try to act like they'll say horrible things. I have a whole folder of hate mail in my phone where they're like, he's going to leave you for a younger woman. He probably doesn't even sleep with you anymore. You guys probably haven't, you know, slept together in years, and it's got to be horrible and miserable for you. And it's like, it's not like that for us at all. We are best friends and we get along great, and there's tons of romance and things like, it's like for me, marriage is great. I love it. It's fantastic. It's great for him too. And I like to do nice things for him. I like to bring him his food. I like to bake him his favorite treats. You know, I like to rub his back and make him feel happy. And I don't understand why that is like, it's like they look down on me like I'm a weak, pathetic, you know, lesser being because I like to make my husband happy. It's like you're not a strong, independent Beyonce girl. You're not a boss bitch unless you're like standing on his chest. And it's funny because in the book, I talk about the first cover of Ms. Magazine, which was started by the CIA and Gloria Steinem, who was a CIA agent. It was funded with CIA money. And the very first cover had a picture of the goddess Kali, the Hindu goddess Kali. Now, remember, this is a magazine that's being marketed to suburban housewives in 1972. And they put a blue-skinned Hindu goddess with 6 arms and a garland of men's heads around her neck and a belt with men's severed arms around her waist. And she's got blood dripping from her mouth. She's the Hindu goddess of like vengeful killing of men. Mm-hmm. She was terrifying. She actually had the biggest cult in human history called the Thuggies, which is where we get the word thug from. And they were a cult that specifically murdered men and sacrificed them to her. And they're one of the most prolific, like, human mass murder ritual cults in history. So I thought, That's a bizarre choice to put on a suburban women's magazine, isn't it? Well, the reason is because she's like a symbol of wrathful vengeance against men, and she's often pictured standing on the chest of her cohort Shiva, who's like the male counterpart to her in Hinduism. So given that and what I know about feminism, I'm like, oh, well, I guess from their perspective, that does make sense then, because that's what they're trying to tell women that you need to do. You need to stand on his chest, stand on his neck. You need to be the boot on the man's neck, right? And it's always like men are inherently exploitive and they're going to abuse you. So you have to like beat them at their own game and you have to make them subject to you and you have to dominate them. And first of all, that's exhausting, man. Like, I don't want to have to do all that. But second of all, I love men. Men build the modern world. This computer I'm on, this microphone I'm talking in, I can't build that. And if something breaks or goes wrong with it, I have to go get my husband so he can fix it. And the air conditioning and the heat in my house, the car that I drive, the paved roads I drive my car on, to, you know, like these feminists drive their male-designed, male-built cars on roads that men built, to office buildings that men built, and they turn on their work computer at their desk, and if something doesn't work, they call the IT guy, right? Everything in their modern world is built and maintained by men, and then they'll go, I don't need a man. And I'm like, if the power went out for more than 2 hours, you'd be on your knees in front of the first man that walked by. You know, it's just, from my opinion, this stuff is so absurd. And
I tried to watch one of your debates with one of these women, and I can't remember her name. It was some weird name. Anyway, she was talking about that she would be willing to go out and restore the electricity. Now, one of my best friends, Reed Coverdale, actually does that. And I see he posts pictures because he's actually a popular podcaster as well. And he posts pictures online of the stuff that he's doing. And we're both truck drivers. So I just laughed. I was like, if you just knew half the stuff, like this guy like is working 18-hour days sometimes to keep the electricity on in New Hampshire. Like, what are you talking about? Like, nobody wants to do this.
Right. Well, there's a reason that feminism didn't happen until after the Industrial Revolution, right? Because
all the hard work was done.
Yeah, prior to the Industrial Revolution, women didn't want to do men's work, and they didn't have any stupid illusions that they even could. So the technology we have now has given women this false illusion that they can be strong and independent and they don't need no man. And it's like, I'm sorry, but yes, you do, because everything you think you know how to do in your modern life depends on men. And that's just like facts. Sorry about your life, but that's how it is. And I said to a feminist in a debate one time, you know, you guys say you want equality, but why aren't you out here demanding equal representation in garbage collection jobs, in cell phone tower repair, in oil rig work, in concrete laying, in, you know, the guys who do the deep sea fishing that's super dangerous? Why aren't you demanding equal representation in these jobs? And I'm not going to take you seriously until you do. You want to be in STEM fields, you know, anything where they think that they're going to get a corner office and do business deals with their champagne brunch or something, you know, and they've got their little highlighters, their different color highlighters on their desk. And they, you know, they all think they're going to be Sex in the City. I think that show was like one of the greatest psyops ever. It convinced a whole generation of women that that's what feminism was. You're all going to have this glamorous life where you go to brunch with your girlfriends and you buy the, you know, designer shoes and you live in the city and it's very glamorous. And if you look at the top 20 careers held by women in 1920 and 2020, they are almost exactly the same. The only difference is we swapped out farm labor for HR work. Other than that, the vast majority of women in America do the same shit they did 100 years ago. It's just that now they got to pay for daycare and they get to pay into the tax system for the privilege of doing it. So what are their jobs? They're secretaries. They're daycare workers, they're nurses, they're school teachers, they're bookkeepers, they're retail workers, things of that nature. It's the same thing. I'm sorry, but you guys aren't out there demanding that you get equal representation in construction jobs, or, my husband would build and work on those giant factory machines and food production facilities. Super dangerous. He had to take people to the hospital for like life-threatening chemical burns. One guy cut his hand off. Like, people would fall. Like, these things are super huge and really tall, and they'd be working like 3 or 4 stories up and fall sometime.
Yeah, you're talking about the grain silos?
Well, this is like a Tyson food production facility, but there's some kind of machinery they have in there that's really big, and it goes like really deep into the ground and then really high up. But dangerous shit, hard work. Yeah. Not glamorous, not fun, very dirty, very difficult, very exhausting and tiring. And he worked like 70, 80-hour weeks for 12 years. So that I could stay home. And these women, so my husband, who is willing to work 70 or 80 hours a week, half kill himself for 12 years so that I can stay home and raise our kids. And they don't want me to bring him his plate of food. Excuse me, but I am bringing that man a beer and a plate of food. And that's the least I can do. And it's like, I don't know where we got this idea that just men are shit and women are these goddesses, except once you realize that the roots of this, the philosophical and spiritual roots of this political movement do totally explain that. It explains that mentality of like, I am the bloodthirsty goddess and I'm going to subject you to my wrath if I don't get everything that I want. So, yeah.
Something keeps bouncing around in my head. One of the things I'm doing for my paid subscribers is I'm reading and breaking down an essay on the principle of population by Thomas Malthus. Okay. And so I'm wondering, because one of the things I tend to see is like, when I look at like the global warming agenda, I look at the LGBTQ agenda, I see modern eugenics.
Oh, yes. 100%.
So how much of the feminist movement, even from its roots, fit into the eugenics movement?
A lot. So my chapter in the book on Margaret Sanger was the hardest one on me mentally. I got so upset at certain points of writing that chapter that I would have to like go take a break, because I'd either get really angry or I would cry, because she was kind of groomed and chosen to promote the birth control and Planned Parenthood agenda. And she worked with all the same scientists in, we probably can't say what it is. The mean guy with the little mustache, all of his scientists in Germany in the 30s, 20s and 30s. That's where she was, and that's who she was influenced by in feminism.
Bob? I know Bob.
Yeah. Wow. Eugenics was huge from like the mid 1800s until World War II. It was very popular because Darwinism had just come out, and this idea that we're going to create some kind of super race, we're going to clean up the genetic pool, things like that. And the Malthusian fear-mongering about overpopulation as well all had like this big influence on the universities and therefore on like science and the medical field. I just did an episode like a month ago with Jay Dyer about institutional capture and how that works. How these ideas get disseminated through universities, through academia, and through the like intelligentsia, and become mainstream and become just like accepted without having to be really truly vetted or proven. And this eugenics was one of those ideas. And yes, it was like this idea of, we need to lower the birth rate. We need to get women into there was a number of reasons they wanted feminism. One was you get women paying into the income tax system, which was brand new. Remember the Jekyll Island Club, who kind of shoved through the Federal Reserve Act and the income tax stuff around 1913. Those were the same guys who were supporting women's suffrage and birth control and things like that, because they wanted women workers. And there was good reasons for that. You get double the tax base, you get cheap labor because women are unskilled, but also because you rapidly increase the labor pool in a very short period of time, which drives down wages. We saw that around the turn of the century, like 1920, and then we saw it again, even bigger wave of that in the 70s when so many women started going off to college and entering the workforce. You saw wages just get depressed because we flooded the labor market. So there were actually campaigns, I believe, in parts of Russia and Germany to stem that because it got so bad for the economy, where they were trying to do something to get women to stay home a little more because men's unemployment was so high and men's wages were so low, and it was causing more social unrest than was already happening. But yes, eugenics is extremely tied in. And Malthus now has been debunked. But for 200 some years, everybody just believed what he had written and what his theories were. And this idea, I do cover that a little bit in the book. I talk about Malthus, and then I talk about that book, The Population Bomb, which has also been debunked. But that book was the thing that started the global warming, climate change stuff, like really kicked it off. So it had the effect of starting climate change activism and feminist activism with like Planned Parenthood, birth control, that kind of thing, all at the same time, because it was just a rehashing of Malthusian ideas that like, oh, we're not going to be able to feed the world's population. And that turned out to not be true, because as technological progress continued to advance, actually a bigger population produces more food. So having this population shrinkage like they're having in Japan and Russia and places like that has actually been very bad for keeping the food supply up. If you don't have enough people to work and produce food, then even the population you do have doesn't have enough food. Anyway, all of that.
Well, you don't have enough minds to come up with the ingenuity of the modern, society.
Yeah, exactly. We have this aging population, and the smaller, younger population can't keep up with the innovation, and it's like a brain drain effect a little bit. And we can definitely see that right now, because like, have you tried to go anywhere lately? There's nobody working anywhere. Every single place you go is understaffed, and the staff they do have are not trained and don't know what the heck they're doing. And it's everything from, a store to a restaurant. Any kind of like public place you go, they're short staffed and nobody knows what the hell they're doing. And I mean, if you go back and read the Margaret Sanger chapter of the book, I do explain how she was very big into eugenics, and she was supported and propped up and pushed forward by all of the biggest eugenicists of the time. And Rockefellers also, they had like a stranglehold on the petrochemical market, and they wanted pharmaceuticals made from those, right? So they played a really huge part in the medicalization of healthcare. It used to be a little bit more holistic, more naturopathic, and they wanted to make it all pharmaceutical based and corner the market on that. So they were very happy to support things like the birth control pill and just generally the medicalization of healthcare. Because they were, them, and then the pharmaceutical families also did. So yes, eugenics is extremely tied in. One of Sanger's books made me so upset because I'm almost positive it was complete bullshit and that it's totally plagiarized. I'm still in the process of like proving that. So in the book, I just propose it as a theory. But she wrote this super influential book that scared the bejesus out of women everywhere, where she claimed to have gotten thousands of letters from women all over the country who claimed that they just were having so many babies. They're having 13, 14, 15 babies, and they don't know what's causing it. And they don't know how to stop having babies. And they almost died 100 times in childbirth, like this total fear mongering. And all the stories sound like the same person wrote them. They all are very like melodramatic and high. Like, my grandma's 97. She was born in 1926. And there's an interview I just did with her on my channel where I asked her, hey, Grandma, did your mom know what was causing babies? And she was like, yeah, of course. She goes, in fact, after my mom had my brother, who was her fourth child, the doctor said, you got some health issues that are going to make having any more really complicated. So you guys should probably not. And they didn't have, so this was like, 1926. She didn't have birth control, but they knew what to do to avoid that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So right away, I'm like, I don't buy this idea that no woman anywhere understood how babies were made in the 1920s. That seems ridiculous. And just looking at the birth rates and the infant mortality rates, if that many women were having 13, 14, 15 kids, that doesn't make sense either. So I looked into the Margaret Sanger Papers archives, and they've got everything that woman ever did. If she sneezed, they have the tissues. If she wiped her mouth on a napkin, they have that napkin saved. I mean, they've got her grocery receipts. They've got her tax records. Anything Margaret Sanger ever did, the Margaret Sanger Papers Project has it. They have an incredibly huge archive of everything. Do you think they have any of those letters that she claims were written to her from thousands of women all over the country?
Not one.
Well, they got 13.
Oh.
They have 13 out of the 2,000 that Sanger said she based this book off of. And their excuse or their explanation for this is they were lost to time. None of the other shit was lost to time, but all of this was lost. So I am like, and she plagiarized often. Like we know many instances where she just lied, created propaganda, things like that. So I'm almost sure the book is baloney, but it scared a whole generation of women half to death that childbirth was like this. And people still think this. I debate these women and they think there's like a 50-50 chance I might die in childbirth or something like that. Like they think it's way more dangerous than it is. And even prior to the medicalization of childbirth, it wasn't as dangerous as what people think. Obviously, humanity wouldn't be here if it was. If you had like a 40% chance of dying in childbirth, we wouldn't have ever made it as a species. So that was propaganda and lies, the stuff that they used to get Planned Parenthood passed, because that was, again, a thing that the population didn't want. They didn't want abortion, and they didn't want birth control, hormonal pills, and all that stuff. They were very suspicious of it, and they thought it was unnatural, and they thought it was probably not a very Christian thing to do. So they lied. The founding of Planned Parenthood is completely fraudulent. The doctors that they would prop up and have them cite certain statistics and reasons why we needed this, it was all fake. And it all came out a few decades later when a bunch of those doctors came forward and said, yeah, we lied. We were paid to lie about, the risks of childbirth and why women need abortions and things like that. It's all in that chapter of the book, but it's all propaganda and lies. It's not really true, but so many people still believe it. I debate these feminists and they're like, we have to have a right to abortion because pregnancy and childbirth is extremely dangerous and women die all the time. And I'm like, no, they don't. It's a pretty low risk that you have a way higher risk of dying just by getting in your car and driving to work, or taking a bath, or swimming in a lake, or a dozen other things, right? But they believe this. They believe that like childbirth is this thing that kills you. And yeah, it does sometimes. Sure, of course. We all know that happens sometimes, but it's been way overblown and completely exaggerated. And the people who are the social engineers want an easily controlled population, and they want to be in charge of who's having babies, how many babies, and they want to be in charge of your life from cradle to grave.
Yeah.
It makes sense why they would like feminism, why they would like Planned Parenthood and family planning and birth control. I think the current statistic is 88% of all women are on birth control, hormonal birth control at some point in their life now. And that has a huge effect also on the way that relationships with men and women. How
many of the women on birth control are under the age of 18 nowadays?
I would have to check to update that, but it's very high. It's very high because you can just family, like when my older girls got their periods, our family doctor tried to have like a private conversation with them about how they would put them on birth control without telling me. if they were sexually active.
I remember when I was in high school in the 90s, and this was probably 95 or 96, I would take my buddy's girlfriend to Planned Parenthood, and they would give her birth control for free.
Yep. They did that. I did that. When I was in high school, I did the same thing. And my mother completely endorsed it and told me I should because she had worked for them. All you have to do is go down there and they just check your iron level and give you a pap smear. And here's your whole bag with like 6 months worth of birth control and condoms for free.
Yeah.
And now you can get it at Walmart for $4 a month. You go to your county health place, you go to Planned Parenthood, and the vast majority of medical doctors, like your family doctor, are super happy to write a prescription for that. I'm actually doing a stream on birth control with Jamie Hanshaw very soon because women are not told about all of the risks and what it actually does to you. And like the risk of infertility and like mental issues, mental health problems, and the way that hormonal birth control works, it makes your body think you're already pregnant, which changes your mate selection as a woman. So if you think you're already pregnant, you're going to go for like safer, softer, more like beta male types of men. Whereas if you weren't on that birth control, you'd probably be more attracted to kind of stronger, more masculine types. So I think that's had like a huge effect on relationships with men and women just from that standpoint. And it also kind of makes you crazy. Like being on all those hormones all day, it kind of makes you crazy. When I was on it as a younger woman, I felt like I was going insane. I stopped taking it because I'm a very like rational, even keel kind of person. And when I was on hormonal birth control, I was like a crazy person. And I didn't even understand what was going on in my own head. So I was like, that's enough of that for me. But
did you
like candy now? You know?
Did you touch any on the Jaffe memo?
No, not in the book.
Okay.
But I am aware of it.
Yeah, I figured you were. I mean, I've heard enough of your stuff where I'm like, oh, she knows what the Jaffe memo is. So,
yeah.
So in that memo, there's a point where he writes that abortion on demand is a goal.
Yeah.
It's taken 60 years to get to the point to where the public is actually asking for abortion on demand. At least some, not a majority, but some semblance of the public to be recognized is asking for abortion on demand. I can't help but think how these people used Bernays and his kind of logic behind propaganda in order to spread these messages and just creep it into society.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Bernays is the one who got women smoking. But yeah, in that series I did with Courtney, we just did a whole bunch about propaganda and public opinion and the manipulation of it. And they used psychologists and they used like mass communications, and Edward Bernays is like really it's a psyop. It's like psychological warfare. And I'm writing my second book right now, which I hope will be out by the end of the year. It's a much bigger undertaking than the first one. And it's more about what they did with feminism in like the communist and Soviet regions like Eastern Europe and Russia. Because Russia was the first country that legalized abortion in 1920. And there was a woman who was responsible. She was, so like people are really familiar with Stalin and they're really familiar with like Stalin economics. People don't tend to know as much about the Bolsheviks. They just kind of know Lenin came first. But what they don't know is the Bolsheviks were like very much into the social justice stuff, just like what we have now. They were really into sexual liberation. They had a whole sexual liberation movement in the 1920s and 30s, way before we ever had it here in America. It was way more extreme. And they had their commissar for social welfare was a woman named Alexandra Kollontai. And she was basically the Russian Margaret Sanger, but 10 times worse. And she was a super radical feminist. She took the church, the Orthodox Church, and like seized all their property. She was the person behind like taking the monasteries, stealing the church's wealth, destroying the church. And she made abortion in Russia legal, and more than legal, it was paid for in state hospitals. So it was free and it was on demand and it was up to the day of birth, right? So between 1920 and I want to say like 1936, when Stalin took power, he had to make abortion illegal again because they got to the point where they had 3 abortions in Russia for every 1 live birth in just a span of like 18 years or something. And with the famine and World War I, he was like, we ain't going to have a population. We won't be able to raise an army. And he could see World War II ramping up. So he's like, we have to make abortion illegal again. But that's how bad it got that fast. And it was through a combination of sexual liberation, destruction of the church, and free on-demand abortion that it got that bad that fast. And so it was kind of, I feel like Bolshevik Russia was a testing ground for a lot of the stuff that they ended up doing after World War II here in the States. It was kind of like a beta testing that they did over there. And a lot of the same Western banking elite that were funding feminism here were also funding Bolsheviks. They had 2 different approaches. Here it was like a classical liberal feminism where, yes, we want you to have a career. We want you to have your own money. Women should have property. It was a very like capitalist version, whereas in the Bolshevik version of feminism, it was about the social justice liberation part. And they wanted to do feminism there because they said, well, look, private property is passed down through the men. It's the patriarchy that allows capitalism and private property and property rights. If nobody knows who their dad is, nobody's going to be passing down any wealth. There will be no incentive to build wealth or own property because you can't leave it to your kids because no one will know who their dad is. So they were the first ones to make marriage not a sacrament of the church and instead just a legal license. They had super free and easy, no-fault divorce already in like 1918, way before we had it here, right? Like 70 years before we had it here.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I was going to say that didn't come through until Reagan here.
Yes, I know it. So they were doing all this stuff there, and it was the same Wall Street banking elite that were funding both sides and both methods, seeing, kind of just testing and seeing what worked. So the second book's going to be a lot about that and some of the wacky stuff that was going on there, because it's nuts. There's a lot of new information coming out of Russia now that, like in the last 5 years, a lot of historical records, we have access to them now, and we didn't for all this time until just recently. So it's been super fascinating going through all that stuff. But yeah, it's always tied in with eugenics and population control. It's always tied in with control of the family, resources, things like that. Women in America now control 80% of spending. 80% of spending in this country is controlled by women. And so Edward Bernays and all his marketing research, that's all pointed at women now. Women are and not only do we control all the money, most women, like in the boomer generation, are going to see a double windfall in their lifetime. So they'll inherit their parents' money, and they'll also probably get their husband's money because he will more than likely die before she does. So they just have incredible control. And like my big kind of final argument against feminism, I guess, would be that feminism did not create equality. It radically threw off the equality that already existed. So in God's creation, we already had built-in equality because men have the monopoly on force and women have the monopoly on like sex and procreation. Every person alive today has twice as many female ancestors as they do male ancestors because women are the choosers, and oftentimes men would die because their jobs are so risky, or they would die in battle when war was, really ubiquitous and we didn't have like drone warfare, So all throughout history, women have had twice as much opportunity to reproduce as men. That's a huge advantage. That's an incredible, just overall advantage in humanity that women have. And when we are young and fertile, we have tremendous power and influence. And so when you, on top of that, give women control of all the money, and you put them in positions of power politically, you give them voting rights, you do all of this stuff where now the world is kind of run by women, and it's thrown off the balance. You see it in family courts where women absolutely dominate men, although that's gotten a little bit better in recent years, but not much. And then you see it in things like prisons and jails where a man and a woman can be found guilty of the exact same crime with the exact same circumstances, and the man is going to get a 40% longer, harsher sentence than the woman does. So like in all these different aspects of society, women, it's set up for women to win and for men to fail. And I feel like public schools, another really good example. Public schools are horrible for boys. They're created for girls. It's all about sitting still and following orders and doing your homework and coloring inside the lines. And it's because most of the teachers are women and a lot of the stuff is controlled by women. It's very girl oriented, and little boys always end up getting put on drugs. They're always in trouble because boys are going to take more risk. They're more energetic, right? They have a little bit of natural aggression, which is good, but we squash it in the public school system. So that's another big reason that I advocate for homeschooling, especially for boys. I think that public school is really tough on boys.
All right. I kind of want to get a little wild here right before we get off.
Okay.
All right.
Let's do it.
So I assume, and this may be a false assumption, I haven't heard you talk about this in great detail, but I assume that you have dug into some of the occultism and at least have some of the knowledge of what's going on here. From a spiritual standpoint, what is the goal? Where is this coming from, and what are the ends?
So you and I are both Orthodox Christians. So we have kind of the same view, but I feel like anyone who's broadly Christian will definitely understand this. It's the same game that was being played at the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, which is that women are easy to influence. And if you want to get to the man, the best way to do that is through the woman. If you can influence the women, you can take down the men. And I think that from the beginning, that's been the tactic of the evil one, is to get to the man through the women. And then, of course, through the women, you get to the man via the children as well. And it is a rebellion against patriarchy, which is why I have this campaign to restore the word patriarchy, because it's gotten this like horrific connotation now. When you hear the patriarchy, you think of men being evil oppressors. But in our church, we have patriarchs, right? Mm-hmm. We have Old Testament patriarchs. We have church patriarchs. It's in our ecclesiology. We have a male priesthood. Christ was male. But we do have the Theotokos, the Ark of the New Covenant, the Mother of God, the Queen of Heaven, the chief of all the saints. And I think what the devil does is he tells women, well, yeah, but that's not good enough. You should be the boss. Why should he get to be the boss? Don't you want to be the boss, right? So it's like, it's this way of convincing women that men are the enemy. And by doing that, you convince them that patriarchy is evil, that male leadership is evil, that male headship is evil, and it's really like a rebellion against your father and God the Father, and that turns into a rebellion against your husband, and a general view of men as bad. And we have marriage as a sacrament in the church because it aids us in mutual salvation. When you get married in Orthodoxy, you are on an ascetic path where your fates are intertwined and your salvation is intertwined, and you are supposed to give yourself up for your spouse like Christ did for the church, right? Mm-hmm. And if I were Satan and I wanted to take as many souls as possible and keep people from God and keep them from theosis, that's what I would do. I would try to convince the women that marriage is an evil institution that holds them back from some kind of glorious existence where they're going to be the boss or have some kind of Beyonce, Taylor Swift, existence where everything's very glamorous and all about them and very female oriented. And it serves on so many levels, right? Because I always like to say, I think the devil really hates women. I think he really hates us. And I think one of the reasons he hates us is because he hates the Theotokos. I think he hates the Mother of God because without her, Christ's incarnation wouldn't be possible. And we wouldn't have this amazing example to look to, right? And in my book, I get a lot of criticism because I do lay some blame at the feet of the Catholics and the Protestants for the Catholic Church ending up corrupt enough that we had to have a Protestant Reformation, and then the Protestants for absolutely ripping Mary out of Christianity and putting her way over to the side and telling us that she's not important and don't look to her, don't pay attention to her. I mean, I grew up in like a Calvinist church where it was like, it's idolatry if you even talk about her unless it's Christmas. It was like that. And I was pretty mad for like the first year that they took her from me. I did not know that the Mother of God is alive in heaven and wants to intercede on my behalf, and that we all have this mother in heaven who is the Queen of all saints, and she's like the answer to feminism. And I think that feminism glorifies Eve and Lilith and all of the other female demonic incarnations. I talk about a bunch of them in my book, like Inanna, Ishtar, all these ancient goddess figures. And then we have like witchcraft and Wicca and the modern goddess worship revivals that are going on. And I feel like those are there on purpose to convince women to follow this demonic path, to rebel against the men in their lives who care about them the most and are the most invested in their well-being. Your father, your husband, your brother, your sons, those are the men in your life who have the most vested interest in your well-being. And to believe the narrative of feminism is to believe that throughout all of history, men didn't give a shit about their mothers, their sisters, their daughters, or their wives, which is preposterous. Have there been men who are abusive? Sure. Are there not women who are abusive? Right? So I just think that it works on every level. And that's why it's the very first move that Satan made, was to go through the woman, because then he gets the woman and he gets the man. Kill two birds with one stone. And it's been effective from the beginning, and it's still effective right now. It's probably more effective than it's ever been because of, technology and propaganda and things. And yeah, that's what I think is going on the spiritual level. It's the best way to, lower the population, make sure people aren't having families, make sure they're not getting married, make sure they're looking at alternative lifestyles, which we know are going to hinder their salvation. It gives you everything you'd ever want if you were an adversary to God.
Well, hell yeah. I love it.
Thanks for letting me do my epic monologues. You're very kind. Once I get going, I like to talk.
I'm here to learn. So, and I feel like we touched on some things that you don't normally touch on. So
yeah, I do too, which was really great. And I think this conversation was a little more personal than I usually am, but I think that that's a good thing because maybe it helps people relate to what I'm saying better. And when you told your story too, it probably helps a lot of people relate and think about it from their own life and think about how feminism has affected their life in a way that they maybe never thought of before.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of my style of doing interviews is I just want to converse and be upfront. And who am I? I'm a truck driver that bought a microphone, like.
Yeah, that's me. I'm like a homeschool mom who bought a microphone. Although I must be really doing something with my life now, because I did have a guy accuse me of being a CIA asset and working for Fox News. So
That's what you get for going on Tucker Carlson.
I know. I'm like, dude, that was like a 2.5 minute guest spot just based on an article I wrote. It was pure luck. Don't get so excited about it, but I'm like,
Well,
if you think I'm that powerful, I must be doing something right, I guess. So
yeah.
silly.
Plug away.
Yeah. Plug away.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I do have a YouTube channel now. It's only a couple months old, but it's doing really well. It's just Rachel Wilson on YouTube. I just got a Rockfin channel that'll be going up this week. My Substack is rwilson.substack.com. I do a lot of writing on there about things where I can go really in depth and cite all my sources and stuff. So that if you've seen some of my videos and you want more, my Substack is the place to go for all the details. The book is Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. It's on Amazon. Or if you really hate Amazon and you don't want to go through them, you can contact me. Any of my social medias is fine, and I can get you a copy straight from me. And then I debate on the Crucible YouTube channel. So if you want to see me smash some feminists and take some feminist heads, you can go there. I've done a few on modern day debate too, but I feel like the Crucible ones are the best. And Rach for Patriarchy on Twitter. Rach, the number 4 Patriarchy on Twitter.
Cool.
Yeah.
I want to tell you a story, but I'm going to wait till I end the recording.
Okay.